There is a letter in the archives at Hagley, written in the spring of 1801, that most Americans have never heard of. It is addressed to Thomas Jefferson, then President of the United States, and it comes from a 30-year-old French émigré named Eleuthère Irénée du Pont. The letter is polite, carefully worded, and contains a business proposal. Dupont wishes to manufacture gunpowder for the young republic. He is trained under Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry, in the Royal Powder Works of France. He has seen American powder, purchased some on a hunting trip, watched it misfire, watched it clump and degrade, and he believes he can do better. He is asking, in essence, for Jefferson's blessing. Jefferson gave it. That single exchange, a refugee's pitch, a president's nod, set in motion something that would take 2 centuries to fully reveal itself. The Dupont family would not merely build a business, they would fuse a private fortune to an entire state's government, write their own corporate laws, employ half the workforce of Delaware at the dynasty's peak, and construct a ring of estates so vast and so interconnected that for generations they exposed a real question. Where did the Dupont family end and the state of Delaware begin? The answer, for most of American history, was that no one could say. And that was precisely the point. Consider the geography. The Brandywine Creek flows southeast through the Piedmont of northern Delaware, dropping roughly 100 feet in the 4 miles above Wilmington, before emptying into the Christina River and, eventually, the Delaware Bay. In 1802, that gradient was power. Literal, convertible, bankable power. Mills had lined the Brandywine since the 1740s. Flour mills, paper mills, cotton mills. The creek turned water wheels, and water wheels turned profit. What Eleuthère Irénée du Pont saw, when he rode out from Wilmington to inspect a parcel of land that spring, was not just real estate. He saw a machine waiting to be loaded. The property belonged to Jacob Broom, who had operated a cotton mill on the site and was willing to sell. 95 acres. The price was $6,740. DuPont paid it, and by the summer of 1802, construction had begun on what would become the Eleutherian Mills, the first high-quality gunpowder manufactory in the United States. The site still exists. You can walk it today if you know where to look. The Hagley Museum preserves what remains: granite foundations, moss-covered raceways, the stone shells of buildings that once shook with controlled explosions. Stand at the edge of the mill race on a quiet morning, and you can almost hear it. The rush of water through the sluices, the thump of stamp mills pulverizing charcoal and sulfur and saltpeter into black powder, the shouts of workers in French and English, the constant low-grade tension of men who knew that any spark, any friction, any careless gesture could turn their workplace into a crater. This was the DuPont genius, visible from the very first day. They did not avoid danger. They managed it. They systematized it. They built it into the architecture itself. Look at the mill buildings as DuPont designed them. 3 walls of heavy stone, Pennsylvania granite, local fieldstone, walls 2 feet thick in places, and a 4th wall facing the creek made of nothing but light wooden planking. The roofs were flimsy by design, wooden shingles over light framing. The floors sloped toward the water. Every structural choice answered a single question. When this building explodes, not if when, where do we want the blast to go? Away from the other mills, away from the powder stores, away from the workers housing up the hill, out over the creek, where the force would dissipate harmlessly into air and water and the stone walls of the opposite bank. Between 1802 and 1921, there were 288 explosions at the Brandywine Mills. 228 men died. The DuPonts buried their workers in a cemetery just up the slope, held services, paid widows' pensions that were considered generous for the era, and never once considered shutting down the operation. Death was the cost of doing business. The architecture was the cost of limiting death. The fortune being assembled on the Brandywine was built stone by stone on a calculation that most American businessmen of the era would not have made, that skilled labour was worth protecting, that institutional knowledge had value, that a workforce which trusted its employer, even in the face of regular catastrophe, was more productive than one that did not. This was paternalism, certainly. It was also strategy, and it worked. By the end of 1804, the Eleutherian Mills had sold 39,000 pounds of powder. The following year, sales tripled. Thomas Jefferson's patronage opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed to a French immigrant with an unpronounceable name. Federal contracts flowed to the Brandywine, and John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company became a regular customer. DuPont powder loaded the rifles that pushed the frontier westward. DuPont powder fired the cannons that guarded American harbors. DuPont powder, by the 1820s, blasted the rock for the canals and railroads that were stitching the young nation together. And all of it, every barrel, every contract, every explosion, every death, flowed back to a single family, living in a cluster of houses on the hill above the mills, their children playing within earshot of the stamp works, their dinner tables set to the rhythm of industrial violence. Eleuthère Irénée Dupont did not live to see his company become an empire. He died in 1834 at 63, having built the foundation but not the cathedral. The business passed to his sons and then to their sons, and the pattern that would define the next century began to crystallize. Duponts married Duponts, Dupont Cousin managed Dupont factories, Dupont Capital funded Dupont Expansion, and the profits stayed inside a family network so dense and so intermarried that by the 1880s, the genealogical charts resembled less a family tree than a root system, tangled, recursive, almost impossible to follow. This insularity was deliberate. It was also, in a sense, inevitable. Who else could you trust with the secrets of gunpowder manufacture? Who else understood the risk calculus, the chemistry, the particular blend of caution and aggression that the business required? Who else would accept the terms, the danger, the discipline, the expectation that you would live your life within a few miles of the Brandywine, that your children would work in the company offices, that your daughters would marry your cousins and your sons would learn the family trade before they learned anything else? The DuPonts were not merely wealthy, they were a tribe, and tribes, as any anthropologist will tell you, do not share power easily. The wars came, as wars do, and each one fed the mills. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 was a regional conflict, limited in scope, but it demonstrated something important. When the United States government needed gunpowder in quantity, it turned to the Brandywine. The contracts were not enormous by later standards, but they established a precedent. DuPont was reliable, DuPont delivered. DuPont understood that in the explosives business, consistency was worth more than brilliance, because a batch of powder that fired perfectly 99 times out of 100 was worthless if the 100th time it failed to fire at all. And then came the Civil War. By 1861, the DuPont Company was the most prominent black powder manufacturer in the United States. When Fort Sumter fell and Lincoln called for troops, the Brandywine mills were already running at capacity, and the Union's appetite for explosives was bottomless. Over the next 4 years, DuPont sold 4 million barrels of powder to the federal government. 4 million barrels. The number is almost impossible to grasp. It represents every major engagement of the war, every artillery barrage, every infantry charge, every naval bombardment from the Mississippi to the Atlantic. It represents Shiloh and Antietam and Gettysburg and the Wilderness, and the long grinding siege of Petersburg. It represents, in the most literal sense, the explosive force that preserved the Union. The DuPont did not fight the war, they supplied it. And when the guns fell silent in April of 1865, when the veterans came home and the dead were counted, and the nation began the long work of reconstruction, the family on the Brandywine was richer than it had ever been. The mills hummed on, the powder kept flowing, the checks from the War Department cleared. There is a word for this, though it was not widely used at the time. The word is profiteering. The DuPonts would have rejected it, and perhaps they were right to do so. They had not started the war, they had not prolonged it, they had merely manufactured with scrupulous efficiency the product the government demanded. If there was something unsettling about a family growing wealthy from mass death, well, someone had to make the powder. Someone always did. Better it should be made well, made reliably, made by men who understood the chemistry and the risk and the terrible responsibility of putting explosive force into human hands. This was the argument the DuPonts made to themselves and to their critics for the next 50 years. It was not entirely wrong. It was not entirely right either. The moral weight of the explosives business is not a question that admits clean answers. What can be said with certainty is this: by the time the 19th century ended, the DuPont family had discovered the most reliable business cycle in American industry. War, peace made money, Railroads needed blasting powder, mines needed dynamite, construction projects from coast to coast consumed explosives in ever-increasing quantities. But peace was steady, incremental, predictable. War was a windfall. War was a multiplier. War took a prosperous family and made them a dynasty, and the greatest war was yet to come. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. By August, Europe was at war. By the fall, the Allied powers, Britain, France, Russia and their partners, were burning through ammunition at a rate that no one had anticipated, and their domestic manufacturing capacity could not keep pace. They needed explosives. They needed them in quantities that made the Civil War look like a skirmish, and they needed them now. The DuPont Company was ready. In 1914, DuPont's revenues from powder and explosives totaled $25 million. That was a strong year, a prosperous year, a year that would have satisfied any reasonable industrialist. What happened next defied reason. By 1918, DuPont's revenues had reached $319 million. In 5 years, the company sold $1.25 billion worth of explosives, a figure so large that it almost loses meaning. Nearly 1.5 billion pounds of powder and dynamite flowed from DuPont factories to the Western Front, to the trenches of Flanders and the Somme, to the artillery batteries that turned the fields of France into moonscapes. 40% of all the explosives used by the Allied powers came from a single American company, headquartered in a small state on the Atlantic seaboard, controlled by a single extended family whose ancestors had fled the guillotine. The DuPonts were no longer merely wealthy, they were staggeringly, incomprehensibly rich. And they were about to discover that this kind of wealth came with a new kind of scrutiny. The war ended, the treaties were signed, the soldiers came home, those who could still walk, and the nation tried to make sense of what had happened. 10 million dead, 20 million wounded, entire generations erased from the population rolls of Europe. And for what? The idealism of 1917, the war to end all wars, the war to make the world safe for democracy, had curdled into cynicism by 1920. The Senate rejected the League of Nations. The veterans struggled to find work, and a question began to circulate in editorial pages and church halls and the corridors of Congress. Who had benefited from this catastrophe? The munitions makers, the arms dealers, the men who had sold the bullets and the shells and the poison gas, the men who had turned the blood of a generation into balance sheet entries, the merchants of death. The phrase did not originate with the DuPonts, but by the mid-1930s it had attached itself to them like a brand. In 1934, Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota, a progressive Republican with a gift for theatrics and a deep suspicion of East Coast money, convened a special committee to investigate the American munitions industry. The Nye Committee, as it came to be known, held 93 hearings over 2 years. It subpoenaed records, it called witnesses, it put the executives of the nation's largest arms manufacturers under oath and asked them to explain in detail how they had made their fortunes. The DuPonts testified. They brought their lawyers. They answered questions with the careful precision of men who had spent their lives managing explosive materials. And they watched, with mounting frustration, as Senator Nye painted them as war profiteers, as cynical manipulators who had dragged the United States into a European conflict for the sake of their account books. The accusation was not entirely fair. The DuPonts had not started the war, had not lobbied for American intervention, had not manipulated the political process to ensure that their products would be needed. They had simply manufactured, at enormous scale and with remarkable efficiency, the explosives that the Allies demanded. If the war had not happened, they would have been content to sell blasting powder to mining companies and construction firms. But the war did happen, and they had supplied it, and now they were being asked to answer for the consequences. Pierre S. Dupont, the family's most consequential strategist, watched the hearings with something between contempt and calculation. He understood what Nye was doing, understood the political theatre, the appeal to isolationist sentiment, the way the merchants of death narrative played in the heartland. He also understood that the narrative was a distraction. The real story of the Dupont family was not about war profiteering. It was about something far more interesting and far more durable. It was about transformation. Rewind to 1902. Eugene Dupont, the president of E.I. Dupont de Nemours and Company, is dead. He has run the family business for more than a decade, and now the elder generation must decide what to do with it. They are tired. They are aging. The gunpowder business is profitable but stagnant, and none of them has the energy for the modernization that the new century will require. They decide to sell. The buyer they have in mind is Laughlin and Rand, a competitor. The deal would take the company out of family hands for the first time in 100 years. It would end an era. Three cousins say no. Pierre S. DuPont is 32 years old. He has worked in the company since he was 18, learning the business from the ground up, and he is convinced that the elder generation is making a catastrophic mistake. His cousin T. Coleman DuPont, at 39, is a builder and a deal maker, a man who has made a fortune in streetcar lines and real estate and is looking for his next challenge. And Alfred III, DuPont 38, is the family's most skilled powder man, a hands-on industrialist who has spent his adult life in the mills and knows the manufacturing process as well as anyone alive. The three cousins make a counteroffer. They will buy the company themselves. They will pay with a combination of cash, notes, and, here is the audacity, the company's own future earnings. They are proposing in essence to buy the DuPont empire with the DuPont empire's own money. It is a leveraged buyout before the term exists. The elder generation, exhausted and eager to be done with it, agrees. The cousins take control. What they inherit is not merely a gunpowder company. By 1902, DuPont has absorbed, merged with, or driven out of business nearly all of its domestic competitors. The firm operates 40 plants across the nation. It controls roughly 85% of American gunpowder production. It is, by any reasonable definition, a monopoly. And the progressive era is about to make monopolies very uncomfortable. The cousins do not care. Or rather, they care. But they have calculated that the benefits of consolidation outweigh the risks of prosecution. For 5 years, they expand aggressively, buying smaller firms, rationalizing production, building the infrastructure of a modern industrial corporation. They create separate departments for different product lines. They hire professional managers. They establish a central office in Wilmington that functions less like a family partnership and more like a general staff. Pierre, in particular, is fascinated by organizational structure, by the idea that a corporation could be designed like a machine, with interlocking parts and clear lines of authority and feedback mechanisms that allowed executives to understand what was happening in distant factories. This is the managerial revolution, and DuPont is at its leading edge, but the government is watching. On July 31, 1907, the Department of Justice files an antitrust suit against E.I. DuPont de Nemours Powder Company and 28 affiliated entities. The charge, conspiracy and restraint of trade, in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The government claims that DuPont has used its market dominance to fix prices, crush competitors, and extract monopoly profits from a product essential to American industry and defense. The case takes 4 years to wind through the courts. In 1911, the Supreme Court rules against DuPont. The Gunpowder Trust must be dissolved. The company is ordered to divest itself of its holdings, to spin off competitors, to submit to a restructuring that will restore competition to the American explosives market. For most industrialists, this would have been a disaster. Pierre S. DuPont saw it as an opportunity. The antitrust ruling forced DuPont out of the explosives business, or rather, forced it to share that business with newly created competitors. But it did not prohibit DuPont from entering other industries, and Pierre had been thinking for years about what those industries might be. Chemistry. The future was chemistry, not the chemistry of black powder. That was a mature technology, well understood, offering limited scope for innovation. The future was synthetic chemistry. Dyes, plastics, paints, fibers, materials that did not exist in nature, but could be created in a laboratory. Germany had dominated this field for decades, but the war had disrupted German supply chains and created an opening for American firms. Pierre intended to exploit that opening. The transformation happened faster than anyone outside the company expected. By 1920, DuPont was manufacturing Duco lacquer, a fast-drying automotive paint that revolutionized the automobile industry. General Motors, in which Pierre had been quietly accumulating stock, became the largest customer. By 1930, the product line included rayon, cellophane, and an expanding array of plastics. The explosives business remained profitable. Wars kept happening after all, but it was no longer the core of the enterprise. DuPont had become a chemical company, and chemical companies could make almost anything. In 1935, a DuPont chemist named Wallace Carruthers synthesized a new polymer in the company's research laboratories. It was strong, elastic, resistant to heat and chemicals, and could be drawn into fine threads. DuPont called it nylon. Within 5 years, nylon stockings had replaced silk as the legwear of choice for American women. Within a decade, nylon was everywhere, in parachutes and ropes and tires and 1,000 other applications. The patent was worth billions, and then came neoprene, and then came Teflon, and then came Freon, each one a product of the same institutional machinery: the research laboratories, the managerial systems, the willingness to invest in pure science without knowing exactly what the payoff would be. Pierre Dupont had built a company that could invent the future, but Pierre had also built something else, something less visible, but no less consequential. He had built a relationship with the state of Delaware. You cannot understand the Dupont story without understanding Delaware. The state is small, 49 miles wide at its broadest point, fewer than 1 million residents even today, easily overlooked on a national map. But size in American politics is not always correlated with power. Delaware had something the Duponts needed: a government that could be shaped, a legal system that could be tailored, a corporate charter law that could be written to suit the needs of a single dominant family. The Duponts did not conquer Delaware by force. They did not need to. They simply employed it. By the 1920s, DuPont was the largest private employer in the state. The company's payroll supported Wilmington, supported the towns along the Brandywine, supported the merchants and tradesmen and professionals who served the families of DuPont workers. A DuPont executive who wanted something from the state legislature, a tax break, a regulatory exemption, a tweak to the corporate code, did not need to bribe anyone. He simply needed to make a phone call. The legislator on the other end of the line understood, without being told, that his constituents' livelihoods depended on DuPont's continued prosperity. The alignment of interest was so complete that coercion was unnecessary. This was the company state. Not a conspiracy, not a shadowy cabal, but something more durable, a fusion of economic and political power so thorough that the two became indistinguishable. And above the mills, above the factories, above the company offices in downtown Wilmington, the Duponts built their estates. Winterthur, where Henry Francis Dupont assembled one of the world's great collections of American decorative arts in a mansion with 175 rooms. Nemours, where Alfred Thurst Dupont constructed a French-style chateau surrounded by 300 acres of formal gardens. Longwood, where Pierre himself transformed a Quaker farm into a horticultural showpiece, with conservatories and fountains and 1,000 acres of gardens open, eventually to the public. Granogue and Eleutherian Mills, and a dozen other properties scattered through the Brandywine Valley. A ring of wealth and cultivation, and carefully managed privacy that enclosed Wilmington like a hedge around a garden. The Duponts lived behind those hedges, they married behind them, they raised their children behind them, and from behind them, for nearly 2 centuries they ran a state. The ruined walls of the Hagley powder yard stand silent now. The water wheels have not turned in 100 years. The blast walls that once angled toward the creek, saving workers, saving machinery, channeling destruction away from the things that mattered, have softened into monuments. Visitors walk the paths that powder men once walked, reading plaques that explain the chemistry, admiring the restored gardens, taking photographs of the stone shells of buildings where 228 men died over a century of managed explosions. The DuPont company no longer makes gunpowder. It no longer makes nylon either. Most of the legacy chemical businesses have been spun off, sold, or restructured out of existence. The name remains on buildings, on foundations, on the Children's Hospital in Wilmington, but the operating company that Pierre S. Dupont built is a ghost of itself, absorbed into mergers, hollowed out by divestitures, its workforce a fraction of what it was at the dynasty's peak. And yet, the corporate charter laws that Delaware pioneered in the early 20th century, laws shaped in significant part by DuPont interests, still govern more than half of all publicly traded companies in the United States. The family estates still stand behind their hedges, foundations now, museums now, but still markers of a concentration of wealth and power that once seemed as permanent as the granite walls of the mills themselves. The pattern that Eleuthère Irénée Dupont established in 1802, a private fortune woven into the fabric of the American state, invisible, durable, almost impossible to disentangle, has not disappeared. It has only changed form. The question this film will answer is not whether the DuPonts were good or evil, patriots or profiteers, builders or exploiters. The question is simpler and harder. How does a single family hold a state for 200 years? What does that grip look like from the inside and the outside? And what happens when, if, it finally begins to loosen? The mills on the Brandywine are quiet now, but the structure they built is still standing. The structure was still standing, and in the decades after the Second War ended, it reached the fullest expression of its power. By the late 1940s, the DuPont Company had completed its transformation from explosives manufacturer to chemical colossus. The gunpowder that had built the fortune was now a footnote. The real money, the rivers of profit that flowed through Wilmington and out into the family trusts, the foundations, the estates behind the hedges, came from the invisible threads that held together modern American life: nylon stockings, cellophane wrappers, rayon fabrics, Teflon coatings, Freon refrigerants. The synthetic materials that the company's chemists had conjured from petroleum and coal now clothed the nation's women, preserved its food, cooled its homes, and coated its cookware. Textile fibers and plastics alone accounted for more than 3/4 of the company's profits by the 40s and 50s. DuPont had become the chemistry of the American century itself, and the state of Delaware had become, in ways both visible and invisible, a company state. The numbers tell part of the story. At the dynasty's peak, DuPont companies employed up to 1 in 10 Delawareans directly, a figure that understates the true reach, because it does not include the suppliers, the contractors, the service businesses, the restaurants and dry cleaners and hardware stores whose survival depended on DuPont paychecks. In a state as small as Delaware, population barely 300,000 at mid-century, smaller than many American cities, that concentration was suffocating. Not oppressively so, not for most people. Suffocating the way a warm blanket is suffocating on a cold night. You don't fight it. You sink into it. You stop noticing that you cannot quite breathe. The nylon plant at Seaford shows what this looked like at the local level. Seaford sits in Sussex County, in the flat agricultural country of Lower Delaware, as far from Wilmington's corporate offices as you can travel without leaving the state. In the late 1930s, it was a small town surrounded by chicken farms and vegetable fields. The kind of place that young people left as soon as they could find a reason. Then DuPont found a reason to come to them. The company chose Seaford for its nylon plant, the first full-scale production facility for the miracle fibre Wallace Carruthers had invented, for the same reasons any corporation chooses a location. Low taxes. Sussex County had them. Proximity to raw materials and transportation. Seaford was close enough. But the company's internal memoranda were frank about another factor. The labour market in southern Delaware was, in the language of the time, free from agitation. No unions, no tradition of industrial organising, no expectation among workers that they might collectively bargain for better wages or safer conditions. A population grateful for any job that did not involve plucking chickens or picking tomatoes. When DuPont announced the plant's construction, the people of Seaford did not hold public hearings to debate environmental impacts. They did not negotiate for local hiring quotas or tax-sharing agreements. They threw a parade. This was December 1939. The plant was not yet built. No nylon had been produced. No paychecks had been issued. But the news that DuPont was coming, that the company whose name was synonymous with prosperity had chosen their town, their county, their people, produced an outpouring that contemporaries remembered for decades. Marching bands filled the main street. Fireworks exploded over the flat Delaware farmland. Grown men who had spent the Depression years watching their neighbours lose their farms, watching their children move away, watching their towns slowly hollow out, stood on the sidewalks with tears running down their faces. They were crying because of jobs. The nylon plant opened with 850 workers in that first year. As production expanded, as demand for nylon exploded during the war, and then again in the consumer boom that followed, the workforce grew. 4,000 workers, then more. At its peak, the Seaford plant employed 4,600 people, in a town whose entire population had been barely 3,000 before DuPont arrived. The company did not merely employ Seaford. The company was Seaford. Every diner and barbershop and grocery store depended on nylon money. Every church pew was filled with nylon workers and nylon families. Every town council meeting, Every school board election, every decision about zoning or roads or water lines was shaped by the gravitational pull of that one vast employer. This was not corruption. There were no brown envelopes, no midnight meetings, no explicit trades of money for votes. It was something more complete than corruption. It was a kind of absorption. The interests of the town and the interests of the company had become so perfectly aligned that the idea of conflict between them seemed absurd, ungrateful, almost treasonous. You did not question DuPont in Seaford. You did not vote against DuPont's interests. You did not agitate or organize or demand. You went to work, you collected your paycheck, you sent your children to schools that DuPont taxes had built, and you thanked God. The same God you worshipped alongside your shift supervisor and your plant manager, and, on some Sundays, alongside the DuPont family members who still occasionally appeared at the Episcopal Church in Wilmington, you thanked God that the company had chosen you. What happened in Seaford happened in various forms across the state. The nylon plant was only the most dramatic example. DuPont facilities dotted the Delaware landscape, research laboratories in Wilmington, manufacturing plants in Newport and Edgemoor and a dozen other sites, administrative offices downtown. The company's needs shaped the state's infrastructure. The company's priorities influenced the state's educational institutions. The company's preferences for low taxes, for minimal regulation, for a legal environment that protected corporate prerogatives, became, as if by natural law, the state's policies. And behind all of it, invisible but everywhere present, was the family itself. The DuPonts did not need to occupy every seat of power. They did not need to personally serve in the legislature or staff every regulatory agency. What they needed was something more subtle and more durable, a shared understanding among everyone who mattered of how things worked. The DuPonts were Delaware. Delaware's prosperity was DuPont prosperity. To serve the state was to serve the family's interests, because those interests were identical. This understanding did not need to be written down or spoken aloud. It was absorbed through 1,000 small interactions. The plant manager's friendly word to the county commissioner at church, the foundation grant that arrived at the university just when the chemistry department needed new equipment, the highway that happened to be built where it would most conveniently serve DuPont facilities. The corporate charter law is where this arrangement finds its purest expression, and this is the structural heart of the story. In 1899, while the DuPont cousins were still consolidating their gunpowder monopoly, the state of Delaware passed its first modern general corporation law under Governor Ebe Tunnell. The statute was permissive by the standards of the time, designed to attract incorporation fees from out-of-state businesses. But it was only the beginning. Over the following decades, the corporation code was repeatedly modified, liberalized, made more accommodating to the needs of corporate managers and the lawyers who served them. In 1911, the legislature amended the code specifically to permit the incorporation of the DuPont Boulevard Corporation, a private company formed to build a highway that would benefit primarily DuPont facilities. The timing was not coincidental. The DuPont family's interests were woven into the statutory fabric from the start. By 1915, Delaware had acquired a national reputation as one of the easiest states in which to incorporate a business. The fees were reasonable, the requirements were minimal, and the courts, particularly the Court of Chancery, with its specialized corporate jurisdiction, offered a level of expertise and predictability that corporate lawyers valued. Much of this was the work of lawyers and legislators with close ties to the DuPont family. They were not bribing anyone. They were building an infrastructure. The real acceleration came after 1913, when New Jersey, which had previously been the incorporation capital of America, reformed its corporation laws under Governor Woodrow Wilson. Wilson, pursuing progressive-era reforms, made New Jersey less hospitable to large corporations seeking legal shelter. Delaware, sensing opportunity, moved in the opposite direction. The corporate code became still more permissive. Liability protections for managers expanded. The fees flowed in. And behind this legal innovation, Wilmington's financial infrastructure grew. 1 month after the state passed its general corporation law, Coleman and Pierre DuPont organized Wilmington Trust Company, a bank that would service the very corporations the new law was designed to attract. The synergy was seamless. Delaware offered the legal framework. Wilmington offered the financial services. DuPont interests profited from both. Today, Delaware is described by legal scholars as the de facto corporate capital of the United States. More than half of all publicly traded American companies are incorporated there. More than 60% of the Fortune 500 maintain their legal residence in a state most of them have never physically operated in. The fees from these incorporations, franchise taxes, filing fees, the endless administrative charges that accumulate when you're the legal home of American capitalism, substitute for the broader taxation that other states require. Delaware has no sales tax. Its property taxes are among the lowest in the nation. The state government runs in large part on the tribute paid by corporations that exist legally within its borders but conduct their actual business elsewhere. This is the DuPont legacy in its most abstract and most durable form. The family did not merely make money. They did not merely influence politics. They authored the legal architecture through which American capitalism now moves. Every corporate merger, every shareholder lawsuit, every board dispute that gets resolved in the Delaware Court of Chancery, every one of these transactions takes place within a framework that the DuPont family helped to build for their own purposes more than a century ago. The powder mills have crumbled, the nylon plants have closed, but the corporate charter laws remain. And then there was the highway. T. Coleman DuPont was, among the three cousins who engineered the 1902 takeover, the showman. Pierre was the administrator. Alfred Thien was the engineer. Coleman was the man who understood, instinctively, the value of grand gestures. In February 1911, he made an announcement that landed in Delaware like a thunderclap. He would build a highway, not a local road, not a short connector between towns, but a highway that ran the entire length of the state, 100 miles from Wilmington to the southern border, the first modern paved road in Delaware's history, and he would build it with his own money. "I will build a monument 100 miles high," Coleman wrote, "and lay it on the ground." The metaphor was deliberate. The DuPonts had built vertical monuments, the estates, the office buildings, the smokestacks of the factories. Now Coleman would build a horizontal one, a ribbon of concrete that stitched the state together and bore forever the family name. The construction took years. The cost doubled from the initial estimate. Coleman ultimately spent $3.9 million, a staggering sum for a private infrastructure project at the time. But on July 2nd, 1924, Coleman formally gifted the highway to the citizens of Delaware. The DuPont Highway, as it would be known forever after, was complete. The beneficiaries were many. Farmers in southern Delaware could now transport their produce to northern markets more efficiently. Motorists could travel the length of the state without navigating mud tracks and unpaved county roads. Economic development accelerated along the highway's route. Towns that had been isolated were now connected to the broader economy. And DuPont facilities, the factories, the research labs, the administrative centres, were now linked by a modern transportation artery that the family itself controlled until the moment of its donation. The land along the highway's path increased in value. The businesses that served highway travellers prospered. The gesture of public generosity was also, as every grand gesture in this story turned out to be, a matter of private advantage made manifest through public infrastructure. Coleman DuPont did not need to bribe the state legislature to build roads that served his interests. He built them himself and gave them away, and the gift was so magnificent that no one thought to ask whose interests it truly served. The family's grip on Delaware's political machinery would continue through the century. Pierre de Pontoise, a great-grandson of the original Pierre, the man who had transformed the company from a gunpowder manufacturer into a chemical empire, served as governor of Delaware, presiding over a further liberalization of banking and corporate law that cemented Wilmington's role as the legal home of American finance. The DuPonts did not merely influence Delaware politics. For generations, they were Delaware politics, moving in and out of formal power as the occasion required, always returning to the estates behind the hedges where the real decisions were made. Which brings us to the estates themselves. They ring Wilmington in a loose arc, each one a monument to a different branch of the family, a different expression of wealth, a different statement of intention. They are gardens now, most of them, museums, foundations open to the public, their admission fees subsidizing the preservation of splendors that were built originally to exclude the public entirely. Visitors walk through them on designated paths, admiring the collections, photographing the fountains, reading the plaques that explain the history. But the estates were not built to be museums. They were built to be fortresses. Consider Longwood. Pierre de Pont, the financial architect of the Cousins coup, the man who diversified the company into chemistry and built the modern corporate structure, purchased Longwood Farm on July 20th, 1906. The property sat in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, just across the state line from Delaware, but close enough to Wilmington that Pierre could commute. The land had been a Quaker farm established in the 18th century, with a stand of old-growth trees that Pierre initially bought to save from a lumber company's saws. But Pierre was not content to be a tree saver. Over the following decades, he transformed Longwood into one of the great horticultural showpieces of the world. Conservatories rose on the Pennsylvania hillside, glass palaces housing tropical plants and rare orchids. Fountains were engineered to rival Versailles, their jets choreographed to music in displays that anticipated by half a century the water shows of Las Vegas. 1,000 acres of gardens spread across the landscape, each section designed with the same precision that Pierre brought to corporate organization charts and capital allocation tables. In 1921, Pierre opened Longwood to the public. He created the Longwood Foundation in 1937. The gardens became a destination, a public amenity, a gift from the Dupont family to the people of the region. But Pierre lived on the property until his death in 1954. The gardens were open, the house was not. The public could enjoy the fountains. They could not enter the rooms where Pierre conducted his private business, where he entertained the politicians and financiers whose cooperation the family required, where the real work of running a state was accomplished behind closed doors. Consider Nemours, Alfred Thurses Dupont, the third cousin, the engineer who understood the machinery of the powder mills better than anyone alive, built Nemours between 1909 and 1910 as a gift for his second wife, Alicia. The mansion he constructed was an exercise in extravagant nostalgia, a French chateau transplanted to the Delaware countryside, modelled consciously on the aristocratic estates that the original Dupont family had left behind when they fled the Revolution more than a century before. Nemours occupies nearly 47,000 square feet, across more than 70 rooms on 4 floors. The grounds include the largest French formal garden in North America, patterned after Versailles itself, complete with a reflecting pool 157 feet long, designed to mirror the mansion's facade. Alfred I filled the house with European antiques, with tapestries and paintings and decorative objects that announced in every room the family's arrival at a level of wealth that only monarchs had previously enjoyed. But Nemours was more than a statement of arrival. It was a fortress built in response to a family wound. Alfred III and Pierre had been collaborators once, fellow conspirators in the cousins' coup that had seized control of the company in 1902. By 1915, they were enemies. The details of the breach were complex, a mix of corporate disagreements, personal jealousies, and the inevitable tensions that arise when too many strong personalities share too much power. Pierre and Coleman pushed Alfred out of the company's management. Alfred responded by building Nemours, a palace that would rival anything Pierre possessed, a monument to a branch of the family that refused to be diminished. The bitter family war that produced Nemours and Longwood, that set cousin against cousin for decades, never truly let outsiders in. The estates competed with each other. Pierre's gardens against Alfred's chateau, foundation against foundation, philanthropy against philanthropy. But the competition was always internal. The Dupont fought among themselves for supremacy within the family's world. They did not invite the public to participate in those disputes. They invited the public only to admire the results. Winterthur, Granogue. The other estates scattered through the Brandywine Valley. Each was a variation on the same theme. Wealth made permanent, made spatial, made visible in ways that ordinary citizens could observe but never touch. The hedges that surrounded these properties were not merely landscaping. They were borders. They marked the boundary between the family's world and everyone else's. Inside the hedges, decisions were made that shaped the state's politics, the region's economy, the nation's industrial future. Outside the hedges, ordinary Delawareans went to work, paid their taxes, voted for candidates the family approved and understood without ever being told explicitly that their world existed at the pleasure of the families inside. The estates still stand. Longwood is a public garden now, visited by more than 1 million people each year. Nemours operates as a museum, its rooms preserved exactly as Alfred I left them, his clothes still hanging in his closets, his wife's jewellery still displayed in her dressing room. Winterthur houses Henry Francis Dupont's incomparable collection of American decorative arts. In 2024, Longwood Gardens acquired Granog, adding another 505 acres to the DuPont landscape that the public can now access. But access is not ownership. The foundations that operate these properties are controlled, in many cases, by DuPont descendants. The boards that govern them are populated by people who move in the same circles the family has always moved in. The estates have been open to visitors, but they have not been surrendered. The public walks through gardens that DuPont money still maintains, admires collections that DuPont taste assembled, and learns a version of history that DuPont foundations have helped to shape. The nylon plant in Seaford is gone now. DuPont announced its closure in 2004, 65 years after those grown men stood weeping in the streets because the company had chosen their town. The jobs that had sustained the community for 3 generations, the jobs that had built the churches and funded the schools and given young people a reason to stay, evaporated in an announcement from corporate headquarters. The plant that had employed 4,600 workers at its peak became an empty building, then a demolition site, then a memory. The people of Seaford did not throw a parade when DuPont left. There were no marching bands, no fireworks, no tears of joy in the streets. There was only the slow, familiar process of a company town discovering what it means when the company leaves. The storefronts going dark, the young people moving away, the older workers trying to reinvent themselves in an economy that no longer needs the skills they spent their lives acquiring. This is what the grip looks like when it loosens. Not a clean break, not a dramatic rupture, but a slow withdrawal of the life force that had sustained everything. The company moves on, the workers remain, and the state, which had organized its laws, its taxes, its educational system, its entire political economy around the needs of that one dominant employer, must learn to survive without it. But the laws remain. The corporate charter laws that Delaware pioneered, that the DuPont family helped to shape, still govern more than half of all publicly traded companies in America. The franchise fees still flow in. The Court of Chancery still adjudicates the disputes of corporations that have never set foot in Delaware except to file their articles of incorporation. The structure the family built has outlived the industrial base that once supported it, and the estates still stand behind their hedges. The families inside them are different now. Foundations instead of dynasties, museum boards instead of corporate boards, but the hedges remain. The boundaries are still visible. The question of who is inside and who is outside has not disappeared. It has only changed form. The boundaries were about to be named. In 1971, a team of researchers working under Ralph Nader arrived in Delaware with notebooks, tape recorders, and a mandate to document what everyone in the state already knew, but no one had ever quite written down. They were young, most of them law students and recent graduates, and they came with the energy of a generation that believed exposure was the same as change. They spent months interviewing, cross-referencing, building organizational charts that looked like family trees, because in Delaware they often were. The report they produced ran to more than 1,200 pages. They called it The Company State. The title was not a metaphor. What Nader's researchers documented with the granular specificity that made such reports so devastating in their moment and so quickly forgotten afterward was not corruption in any conventional sense. There were no briefcases full of cash, no explicit quid pro quos, no smoking guns that a prosecutor could hold up in court. What they found was something more durable and more difficult to prosecute, a system so thoroughly interpenetrated that the question of where the DuPont family ended and the state of Delaware began had no meaningful answer. They counted. 36 charitable foundations controlled by family members, holding assets that totaled more than $400 million. They mapped the boards, corporate boards, non-profit boards, hospital boards, museum boards, university boards, and found the same names recurring like a motif in a fugue. They traced the career paths of state legislators, of judges, of regulatory officials, and found that an astonishing number of them had worked for DuPont, been educated by DuPont-funded institutions, or would move into DuPont-connected positions after their public service ended. They documented the revolving door not as an aberration, but as the normal operating procedure of Delaware governance. The report landed in Washington like a grenade. Newspapers across the country ran stories about Delaware as a cautionary tale, a case study in how corporate power could capture an entire state. Editorial writers expressed shock. Good government advocates demanded reform. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the exposure might force a reckoning. It achieved almost nothing. The legislators who would have needed to pass reform legislation were the same legislators the report had documented as products of the system. The judges who would have adjudicated any legal challenges were the same judges who had come up through the DuPont-shaped legal establishment. The governor's office, the regulatory agencies, the very mechanisms that might have been deployed to break the grip, all of them were staffed by people who had been educated, employed, funded, or socially connected to the families the report had named. The company state described a closed system, and closed systems do not reform themselves in response to external criticism. They wait for the criticism to pass, and then they continue. Ralph Nader moved on to other crusades. The researchers scattered to other projects. The 1,200 pages gathered dust in university libraries, and Delaware remained Delaware. But while the Nader team was conducting their interviews, while they were mapping the connections and counting the foundations, something else was happening in Wilmington that no organizational chart could capture. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. Within hours, grief became rage in cities across America. Wilmington was no exception. The unrest began on the evening of April 5th. Crowds gathered in the streets of the city's predominantly black neighborhoods. Windows shattered. Fires started. By the time the night was over, at least 15 buildings had burned, more than 30 people had been injured, and approximately 400 had been arrested. It was not the worst urban unrest of that terrible spring. Other cities burned longer and lost more, but it was enough to terrify the white establishment that had always kept the state's African-American population at arm's length. Governor Charles Terry, a Democrat who had won office with DuPont support, responded with overwhelming force. On April 9th, he ordered the Delaware National Guard into Wilmington. 2,800 soldiers, armed and in uniform, patrolling the streets of a city of 80,000 people. The immediate violence had already subsided. The fires were out, the crowds had dispersed, but the Guard did not leave. Days passed, weeks, months. The soldiers remained on the streets of Wilmington, manning checkpoints, patrolling neighborhoods, occupying a city that was no longer in any meaningful sense out of control. Community leaders pleaded for withdrawal. Civil rights organizations protested. National observers began to notice that something extraordinary was happening in this small mid-Atlantic city. Governor Terry refused to recall the Guard. When pressed, he offered variations of the same response. The Guard would remain until he was sure that people and property were adequately protected. What he meant by adequately protected, and protected from whom, he did not specify. The soldiers stayed. 9 months. From April of 1968 until January of 1969, Wilmington remained under military occupation, the longest such occupation of an American city since the Civil War, and arguably longer than any occupation even then. Armed troops patrolled streets where children walked to school. Military vehicles rolled past homes where families ate dinner. The city's black residents lived under a kind of martial law that their white counterparts in the suburbs never experienced, imposed by a state government that the NADA researchers were simultaneously documenting as a wholly owned subsidiary of the DuPont family and its corporate interests. The estates on the hills overlooking Wilmington still commanded their views. The families inside them still made their decisions, still funded their foundations, still shaped the politics of the state they had always controlled. And from those hilltops they could look down at a city under military occupation, a city that contained their workers and their service employees and the infrastructure that supported their way of life, and they could watch the soldiers patrol. What did they see? What did they think? The historical record does not capture their private conversations, their dining room discussions, their board meeting deliberations about the crisis unfolding below them. But the silence of the record is itself revealing. There is no evidence that the DuPont family used its enormous influence, the influence that the Nader report was simultaneously documenting in such exhaustive detail, to advocate for an end to the occupation. There is no record of DuPont executives or family members pressuring Governor Terry to recall the Guard. There is no indication that the families behind the hedges deployed their formidable political power to address the crisis that had engulfed the city at the heart of their state. They had the power. The Nader report proved that they had the power, but they did not use it. The Guard remained. In January of 1969, a new governor took office. Russell Peterson was a Republican, a former DuPont research chemist. Even the reformers came from inside the system. But he represented a break from Terry's intransigence. Within an hour of his inauguration, Peterson signed the order withdrawing the National Guard from Wilmington. 9 months of occupation ended with a stroke of a pen, a signature that could have come at any point during those 9 months if the political will had existed to demand it. The will had not existed. The families had not demanded it. The company state had observed the crisis from behind its hedges and had chosen not to act. This is what the NADA researchers could not quite capture in their 1,200 pages. They documented the structural connections, the board memberships, the charitable foundations, the revolving doors. They proved that the DuPont family controlled Delaware in ways that no other family controlled any other state. But what they could not document, because it did not appear on any organizational chart, was what the family chose not to do with that control. Power reveals itself not only in action, but in inaction. The occupation of Wilmington revealed the limits of the DuPont family's sense of obligation to the city that existed outside their hedges. The two events, the report that exposed everything and changed nothing, the occupation that revealed the boundaries of the family's concern, form a kind of hinge in the story. Before 1968, the DuPont grip on Delaware could be understood as paternalism, benevolent or otherwise. The company took care of its workers. The family built roads and funded schools and endowed hospitals. The estates were private, yes, but the wealth inside them circulated through the state in the form of employment and philanthropy and infrastructure. It was possible to argue, and many did argue, that Delaware benefited from having a dominant family whose interests aligned, however imperfectly, with the interests of the state. After 1968, that argument became harder to make. The company state had been exposed and had not reformed. The city had burned and been occupied, and the families on the hills had watched. The system had revealed itself as a system, self-perpetuating, self-protecting, indifferent to critiques from outside, unconcerned with populations that did not appear on its organizational charts. The walls held. That was the revelation of 1968 through 1972. The NADA report named every connection, published every board membership, counted every foundation dollar, and the walls held. The Guard occupied Wilmington for 9 months, and the families behind the hedges did not use their power to end it, and the walls held. The system was not fragile. It was not vulnerable to exposure. It did not depend on secrecy for its survival. It could be documented, criticized, condemned in editorial pages from coast to coast, and it would continue, because the people who would have needed to change it were the same people who benefited from it. This is the lesson the DuPonts taught Delaware, and through Delaware's corporate charter laws taught America. A system does not need to be hidden to be durable. It does not need to be loved to persist. It only needs to be useful to the people who matter and indifferent to the people who do not. The decades that followed were decades of slow dispersal. The family that had held so tightly for so long began to loosen its grip, not through any dramatic rupture, not through reform or revolution, but through the ordinary processes of time. Generations multiplied, fortunes divided. The 1,200 cousins who had once gathered for family reunions became thousands of descendants scattered across the country and the world, their connection to Delaware attenuating with each passing decade. The company changed too. The industrial base that had once employed half the state contracted, shifted, transformed. The chemical plants that had produced nylon and Teflon and Freon began to close, or to move, or to be absorbed into larger conglomerates. The workers who had once known that their futures were bound to the DuPont name found themselves renegotiating that relationship, accepting buyouts, watching their plants become memories. And then came the merger. In 2017, the company that Eleuthère Irénée Dupont had founded on the Brandywine in 1802, the company that had supplied gunpowder to every American war for more than a century, that had invented nylon and neoprene and Teflon, that had employed tens of thousands of Delawareans and shaped the politics of their state for 200 years, merged with Dow Chemical to form Dow DuPont, a corporation so large and so unwieldy that it immediately began planning its own dissolution. The merger completed on August 31st, 2017. Within 18 months, Dow DuPont had broken itself into 3 separate publicly traded companies. Dow, focused on materials science, Corteva, focused on agriculture. and a new entity that retained the DuPont name but bore little resemblance to the company that had carried that name for 2 centuries. The reorganization was a financial maneuver, a restructuring designed to maximize shareholder value and streamline operations. The analysts who covered the deal discussed synergies and cost savings and market positioning. What they did not discuss, because it was not their job to discuss it, was what the restructuring meant for the workers who had spent their careers under the DuPont name, or for the state that had organized its entire political economy around the needs of that one employer, or for the idea, the 200-year-old idea, that one family could bind its fortune to one company and one state, and hold all 3 together across generations. That idea ended in 2017, not with a bang, not with a scandal, not with a dramatic confrontation, just with a press release and a stock ticker and a corporate restructuring that Wall Street analysts deemed efficient. But even as the company dissolved, something else was emerging, something that would transform the DuPont name from a symbol of prosperity into a word that plaintiffs' attorneys spoke with particular emphasis. The chemicals were called PFAS, per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. The industry had known them since the 1930s, had manufactured them since the 1950s, had used them to create some of the most profitable products in corporate history. Teflon, Scotchgard, Gore-Tex, the non-stick coatings on cookware, the water-resistant treatments on clothing, the firefighting foams used at military bases and airports across the country, the chemical bonds that made these products so useful, the carbon-fluorine bonds that repelled water and resisted heat and refused to break down, were the same bonds that made the chemicals so dangerous. They did not degrade. They accumulated in water supplies, in soil, in blood. They migrated from the factories where they were manufactured into the streams and aquifers, and eventually the bodies of people who lived nearby. For decades, the people of Parkersburg, West Virginia, drank water contaminated by runoff from DuPont's Washington Works plant. They did not know what they were drinking. The company didn't tell them. The science emerged slowly, then all at once. Studies linked PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid, the chemical at the heart of Teflon production, to kidney cancer, to testicular cancer, to ulcerative colitis, to thyroid disease, to preeclampsia in pregnant women, to elevated cholesterol that no amount of diet or exercise could control. The workers at the Washington Works plant had been exposed for decades. Their families had been exposed. Their neighbors had been exposed. And the company had known. Internal documents would later reveal that DuPont had known for years about the health effects of the chemicals it was releasing into the water and the air. The lawsuits began. In West Virginia and Ohio alone, more than 3,500 class action lawsuits were filed against DuPont. In February of 2017, the same year as the Dow-DuPont merger, the company settled those suits for $671 million. It was an enormous sum, but it was not the end. The lawsuits kept coming. In June of 2023, DuPont de Nemours, Chemours, and Corteva, the 3 successor companies that had emerged from the breakup, announced a separate settlement of approximately $1.185 billion with public water systems across the United States, addressing claims that stemmed from decades of PFOA contamination. The settlements did not require an admission of wrongdoing. They never do. But they required something else. Money, extracted from corporations that bore the DuPont name, flowing outward to people who had been harmed by products that had made the DuPont fortune. The direction of the flow had reversed. For 2 centuries, the DuPont had extracted value from the land, the water, the labor, the government of the region they controlled. Now, value was flowing the other way, court-ordered, negotiated in settlement conferences, measured in hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. The name that had meant prosperity, that had meant jobs, that had meant the good schools and the well-maintained roads and the charitable foundations that shaped Delaware's civil society. That name now appeared in legal filings as a defendant's caption. The forever chemicals were the forever legacy, the one thing the DuPonts had made that would genuinely persist for centuries, leaching into water supplies that future generations would have to clean. The estates, meanwhile, completed their transformation. Longwood Gardens welcomed its millionth visitor. Nemours opened its doors to tourists who wandered through the rooms where Alfred Thruth DuPont had lived, admiring the furniture and the art and the clothes still hanging in the closets, as though the owner had just stepped out. Winterthur displayed Henry Francis DuPont's collection of American decorative arts to scholars and families on Sunday outings. Hagley preserved the original powder mills where E.I. DuPont had first set up his machinery in 1802. The foundations that controlled these properties were careful to present them as gifts to the public, as evidence of the family's generosity, their civic mindedness, their desire to share their good fortune with the people of Delaware and beyond. The narrative the estates told was a narrative of beneficence. The DuPonts had built these beautiful places, had assembled these remarkable collections, had cultivated these extraordinary gardens, and now they were sharing them with everyone. What the narrative did not emphasize was what the estates had been built to do in the first place: to separate, to create a world inside the hedges that was distinct from the world outside, to establish boundaries that no one could cross without permission. The estates were monuments to exclusion as much as to taste. The gardens were walls as much as they were landscapes. Opening them to the public did not change what they had been built to assert, and the public that walked through Longwood Gardens, that admired the fountains and the conservatories and the precisely maintained beds of flowers, that public still did not own any of it. The foundations controlled the properties, the boards controlled the foundations. The people on the boards moved in circles that the visitors with their day passes would never enter. The estates had been opened, but they had not been surrendered. Meanwhile, the corporation law endured. More than half of all publicly traded companies in the United States remain incorporated in Delaware, not because they have factories there, not because they employ workers there, not because they have any physical presence in the state beyond a registered agent's office in a Wilmington building that houses thousands of such notional headquarters. They incorporate in Delaware because Delaware offers what the DuPonts helped to create: a legal environment specifically designed to serve corporate interests, a court of chancery that adjudicates business disputes with speed and predictability, a body of case law that generations of corporate lawyers have learned to navigate, a legislature that remains attentive to the needs of the entities that generate such a significant portion of the state's revenue. The franchise fees flow in, billions of dollars a year, paid by corporations that chose Delaware because Delaware chose them a century ago. The money allows Delaware to maintain low property taxes, to fund state services without the broader tax base that other states must develop, to operate a government that remains, in its essential structure, a government built to accommodate corporate power. The DuPonts no longer dominate the boards. The family no longer supplies the governors and the legislators and the regulatory officials in the numbers the NADA report once documented. The grip has loosened, but the structure remains. The corporate charter laws still run on the foundation the family helped to lay. The Court of Chancery still operates according to principles that DuPont lawyers helped to establish. The system outlived the family that designed it. This is perhaps the deepest form of power, not the power to control, but the power to create systems that persist after the control has faded. E.I. DuPont did not live to see his company become a chemical empire. Pierre and his cousins did not live to see the merger that dissolved what they had built. Henry Francis DuPont did not live to see his estate become a museum open to anyone with the price of admission. But the things they created, the corporate structures, the legal frameworks, the physical landscapes, continued after they were gone, shaping choices that future generations would make without ever quite realizing that the choice had been shaped for them. The Brandywine still flows past the old mill site. The stone walls that E.I. DuPont built in 1802 still stand. 3 walls of stone to contain the blast, 1 wall of wooden planking to direct the force of the explosion away from the workers toward the creek. The powder works closed long ago. The explosion stopped. The 228 men who died in those buildings over 119 years are commemorated now in interpretive signs that visitors can read as they walk the paths along the water. The creek looks much as it did when a young French émigré first surveyed this land and saw its potential. The water still flows over rocks and around bends and past trees that have grown and fallen and grown again in the 2 centuries since E.I. DuPont decided this was where he would build his fortune. The landscape does not care about fortunes. The water does not remember the names of the men who died. It simply flows, as it has always flowed, as it will continue to flow long after everyone who remembers the DuPont name has joined the dead. The contamination is invisible. The PFAS compounds that leached from DuPont facilities into waterways across the mid-Atlantic do not change the color of the water or the smell of the air. They simply persist, in the groundwater, in the soil, in the bodies of people who may not know they're carrying chemicals that will remain in their blood for years. The forever chemicals are the truest legacy, the one thing the DuPonts made that will genuinely last. Not the estates, which will eventually crumble, not the fortunes, which have already dispersed, not the company, which has already dissolved into successor entities that bear the name without carrying the history. The chemicals will remain, molecule by molecule, bond by bond, long after the last DuPont Foundation has been dissolved, and the last estate has been sold, and the last person who remembers what the name once meant has died. The question the film set out to answer, how did one family hold a state for 200 years, turns out to have been the wrong question. The grip has loosened. The family no longer controls what it once controlled. The company is gone. The dominance is over. The right question is different. What does it mean to lose power when the system you designed keeps running without you? The DuPonts built Delaware in their image. They wrote the laws that still govern half of corporate America. They established the precedents that still guide the Court of Chancery. They created the landscape of estates and gardens and museums that still defines the region around Wilmington. They shaped a tax structure that still exempts residents from the burdens that other states impose. They built a company state, and then they departed, and the state kept running as a company state without them. Perhaps that is the purest form of victory, to become so thoroughly embedded in a system that your presence is no longer required. The DuPonts do not need to sit on the boards anymore. They do not need to occupy the regulatory positions or fund the political campaigns or staff the charitable foundations that shape civil society. The system has internalized their preferences. The structure does their work for them. Delaware remains Delaware, a state organized around corporate convenience, a government calibrated to serve the entities that choose to file their papers here, a political economy built on the needs of business. Not because the DuPonts are still pulling the levers, but because the levers were set in positions the DuPonts chose, and no one has moved them since. The hedges still surround the estates. The walls still stand at Hagley. The water still flows past the old mill site where everything began, and somewhere in a Wilmington office building, a lawyer is filing articles of incorporation for a company that will never employ a single Delaware worker, never pay a single Delaware wage, never contribute to the state in any way except through the franchise fees that will flow into state coffers and allow Delaware to remain what the DuPonts made it. A state that belongs to corporations, designed by a family that understood, before almost anyone else, that the deepest power is the power to set the terms that others must accept. The powder mills are silent now. The explosions have stopped. The men who died building the DuPont fortune are names on monuments that visitors photograph without quite reading. The family has scattered across generations and continents, their connection to this place attenuating with each passing year. The company has dissolved into abstractions traded on stock exchanges, but the creek still runs past the stone walls. The franchise fees still flow into the state treasury. The corporate charters still arrive by the thousands, companies choosing Delaware because Delaware was designed to be chosen. And the hedges still stand, marking the old boundaries, reminding anyone who cares to look that some walls do not need to be defended to endure. They only need to have been built in the right place, at the right time, by people who understood that the truest power is not the power to rule, but the power to shape the ground on which everyone else must stand.